We look at a lion tearing apart a gazelle and declare that might makes right is the law of nature. Yet the moment we contract a lethal virus, which is equally natural, we rush to a hospital to defeat it with science. We sent a prompt into our system today that poses a profound philosophical challenge based on this exact contradiction. The writer asks how humanity might permanently eliminate these so-called jungle rules from our societies, specifically questioning if it is possible to destroy all weapons and eradicate sexual violence once and for all. It demands we examine why humans selectively apply the rules of nature to justify the exploitation of the weak, while rejecting nature the second it inconveniences us.
The prompt strikes at the core of a major philosophical concept known as the naturalistic fallacy. British philosopher G.E. Moore introduced this term in his 1903 book Principia Ethica to describe the mistake of defining what is good or moral based on what exists in nature. The user recognized this cognitive dissonance without even needing the academic terminology. Humans have a long history of looking at the animal kingdom, observing dominance hierarchies or violent predation, and using those observations to validate human cruelty. We say that aggressive behavior is natural, therefore it must be inevitable. But as the prompt points out, illness is ubiquitous in the natural world. Bacteria and viruses operate on pure natural laws. When a human falls ill, we do not accept the disease as a moral good or a biological destiny. We use medicine, engineering, and intellect to overcome it. We treat the disease as an obstacle to eradicate, not a rule to live by.
That selective acceptance of nature reveals a self-serving mechanism in human power structures. The people who argue that might makes right are almost always the ones wielding the power. By framing exploitation, warfare, or dominance as inevitable biological mandates, oppressive systems shield themselves from criticism. If dominance is natural, then the dictator, the conqueror, or the abuser does not have to answer for their actions. They are just playing their part in the ecosystem. But the user challenges us to dream bigger, asking if we can move beyond this and destroy all weapons, ending war entirely. History gives us reasons to be pessimistic about that prospect.
History does offer pessimism, but anthropology offers a different perspective. In 1940, the anthropologist Margaret Mead published an essay titled "Warfare is Only an Invention, Not a Biological Necessity." Mead argued that war is not a natural instinct hardwired into the human brain, but rather a social technology. She compared war to the jury system or writing. It's a method for resolving conflicts that some societies invented and others did not. Mead pointed to specific indigenous cultures, such as the Lepchas of Sikkim, who did not even possess a conceptual framework for organized warfare. When confronted with the idea of armies fighting, they found it incomprehensible. The implication here is massive. If warfare is an invention, then it can become obsolete. We abandoned trial by ordeal because we invented a better justice system. Mead suggested we could abandon war if we develop superior methods for resolving international conflicts.
Saying war is an invention makes conceptual sense, but the physical reality of weapons complicates the user's vision of destroying them all. A weapon is just a tool designed to inflict harm. Even if all nations agreed to dismantle their nuclear arsenals, melt down their tanks, and destroy their firearms, the knowledge of how to build them remains. Furthermore, basic items become weapons in a conflict. A kitchen knife, a heavy stone, or a length of rope can kill. The complete eradication of weapons seems to require a fundamental restructuring of human psychology, not just arms control treaties.
You are identifying the difference between the physical presence of weapons and the cultural willingness to use them. You cannot uninvent the concept of a blade or a projectile. The solution the user is searching for cannot be purely material. It must be sociological. The destruction of weapons is less about melting down every piece of metal and more about rendering the concept of lethal force obsolete in interpersonal and international relations. Political scientist John Mueller has written extensively about the obsolescence of major war, noting that the idea of war between developed nations has become increasingly unthinkable over the past century, not just because of mutually assured destruction, but due to shifting cultural norms. War went from being viewed as a glorious, natural endeavor to a catastrophic failure of diplomacy. To eliminate the jungle rules, the social cost of violence must outweigh any perceived benefit. The culture must view violence not as strength, but as a primitive breakdown of reason.
Let us pivot to the second, perhaps more challenging aspect of the user's prompt. They bring up sexual violence, noting that while the attraction between sexes is a biological reality, male physical power often leads to rape, which they argue can never be excused as a natural right. They ask how we can stop rapes in all situations once and for all. This touches a nerve because it forces us to untangle the biological reality of sexual desire from the horrific act of sexual assault. How do we reconcile the biological differences in physical strength with the goal of complete safety and equality?
We must separate the instinct from the action, just as the user did in their prompt. Feminist criminologists such as Susan Brownmiller in her foundational book Against Our Will shifted the paradigm by proving that rape is not a crime of sexual desire, but a crime of power, control, and domination. It is the ultimate manifestation of the might makes right jungle rule applied to gender dynamics. Biological differences in upper body strength do exist on average between males and females, but strength does not mandate oppression. To stop sexual violence, society must dismantle the power structures that make men feel entitled to women's bodies. We see evidence that this is possible when we look at egalitarian societies.
Those egalitarian societies provide the concrete proof that violence is not a biological destiny. When we examine groups that do not have rigid patriarchal structures, the rates of gender-based violence drop dramatically. It seems the environment dictates the behavior much more than the biology does.
The anthropological data backs that up. Researchers studying the Agta people, a hunter-gatherer society in the Philippines, found a culture where women hunt, fish, and hold equal decision-making power with men. In these communities, gender egalitarianism is the norm. Anthropological studies indicate that in such societies, intimate partner violence and sexual assault are virtually non-existent. The physical difference in strength remains, but because the culture does not link male identity to dominance or female subjugation, the violence does not occur. This tells us that sexual violence is a cultural symptom of inequality, not an inescapable biological drive. The user asks how to stop it once and for all. The answer lies in the total eradication of systemic inequality. When women hold equal economic, political, and social power, the power imbalance that fuels sexual violence dissolves.
But achieving that total eradication of inequality requires more than just changing laws. It requires reshaping the human psyche. We are talking about uprooting thousands of years of socialization. Even if we achieve economic and political parity, what prevents an isolated individual in a dark alley from utilizing physical strength to overpower someone else? Laws act as deterrents, and culture shapes norms, but human behavior features outliers. Sociopathy exists, a total 100% elimination of all violence, as the user hopes for, seems to brush against the limits of human unpredictability.
That represents the deepest tension in this thought experiment. We can design systems to mitigate harm, but eliminating outliers entirely might require invasive measures that compromise human freedom. However, the goal of reducing these incidents to statistical anomalies is within reach. Consider the concept of structural violence, a term popularized by sociologist Johan Galtung. Structural violence refers to the ways in which social structures harm or disadvantage individuals. Poverty is a form of structural violence. Unequal access to justice is structural violence. Most interpersonal violence, including sexual assault and physical robbery, occurs downstream from structural violence. If we build a society that guarantees housing, healthcare, education, and equal standing, the environmental triggers for predatory behavior decrease exponentially. We cannot police every dark alley, but we can eliminate the social conditions that produce the predator in the first place.
This circles back to the user's initial analogy about disease. We did not eradicate smallpox by asking the virus to stop being dangerous. We eradicated it by altering the environment, creating vaccines that made the human body an inhospitable host for the virus. To eradicate the jungle rules from human interaction, we have to make our society an inhospitable host for exploitation. We have to design social vaccines.
That is a brilliant synthesis. Education is a primary social vaccine. Teaching comprehensive consent, emotional regulation, and empathy from a young age inoculates a population against the ideologies of dominance. The user mentioned the cunningness of humans to misuse power and exploit the weak. That cunningness thrives in the shadows of ignorance and systemic vulnerability. When a population is educated to recognize the naturalistic fallacy, they become immune to leaders who claim that aggressive expansion or exploitation is just the natural order of things. When a society embraces mutual aid over hyper-competition, the jungle rules lose their utility.
It requires an ongoing, conscious effort to reject the default settings of our evolutionary past. We evolved to survive in resource-scarce environments, where tribalism and physical dominance offered short-term survival benefits. But we are no longer bound by those environments. We split the atom, we mapped the human genome, and we connected the globe with a digital web. Yet we still rely on Paleolithic hardware to process modern conflicts. The dream the user envisions, a world without weapons and without predatory violence, demands that we take conscious control of our own sociological evolution.
Conscious evolution is the exact mandate. We must stop viewing human nature as a fixed, rigid list of behaviors. Human nature is plastic. It adapts to the container we pour it into. If we build a container defined by the jungle rules, we will behave like predators and prey. If we build a container defined by equity, restorative justice, and cooperation, we will adapt to those norms. The destruction of weapons and the end of sexual violence are not utopian fantasies. They are the logical endpoints of a species that decides to stop weaponizing nature to justify its own worst impulses and instead uses its intellect to overcome them.
The path forward requires us to abandon the comfort of claiming that our flaws are just natural. By recognizing that we have the agency to cure the disease of violence, just as we cure physical illnesses, we can begin to dismantle the systems of power that sustain the jungle rules. Send this episode to someone who appreciates questioning the invisible rules that govern our society.